capability to manufacture and deliver nuclear weapons. I believe that means zero enrichment, zero centrifuges, zero plutonium, and of course an end to ICBM development. That's intercontinental ballistic missiles. Because none of these elements, none of them is necessary for developing civilian nuclear energy, which is what Iran has claimed that it wants. So he's concerned not only about them manufacturing and enriching uranium, but he's concerned about their ICBMs. Now, you know, an ICBM has one purpose, and that's to travel far distances with a weapon of mass destruction in its warhead. Matter of fact, an ICBM that Iran is currently working on can hit the east coast of America. And Benjamin Netanyahu is warning them. Iran has missiles that can already hit Israel. He's trying to warn the West that their aspirations are much greater than just Israel. Remember, America is considered the great Satan. And they take that very literally over there. I say that flippantly sometimes, but you know, they won't even shake, the Iranian leaders won't even shake the American leader's hand, because it would be like shaking Satan's hand. So think about how severe that is. So he's concerned about their delivery, the bow, and the manufacturing of the foremost of their might, their atomic system. We could have a clue here that we're dealing with an attack on their nuclear program. And then he goes on to say, I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and I will scatter those Elamites toward all those winds, and there will be no nations where the outcasts of Elam won't go. So in other words, whatever happens when the bow is broken at the foremost of its might creates a worldwide dispersion. But it's a worldwide dispersion. It's not an isolated dispersion. It says there'll be no nations where the outcasts don't go. So the indigenous population in that area is going to be so adversely affected, it almost sounds like a humanitarian crisis. And we can compare that to another modern day example of scattering in refugees right now that is not worldwide. And that's in the Syrian refugee camps. You know, Syria's been in a revolution for over almost 5 years now, getting close to 5 years. And there's about 22, 23 million Syrians. Half of them have been affected. About 6.5 million of them have been displaced. You see that 2 to 3 million are refugees. You see them, the populations in the refugee camps they're in, scattered around the borders of Syria. You've got them in Jordan, you've got them even in Egypt and Turkey. It's heavy populations in Lebanon, even in Iraq. But notice those are, they left the borders of Syria and went to the nearest refugee camps they could. They're not scattered worldwide. So it's a difference, apparently, from what Jeremiah is saying to what we see right here. Now, just a side note, there's this group going over there. A lot of these Syrian refugees are coming to know Jesus Christ. They're hearing the gospel. And one example is Mafida's widows. It's called the Widow's Sisterhood. There's a picture of Mafida. They're reading the Bible to widows in one of the Turkish border refugee camps. There's about 500,000 refugees there. These are widows that have lost their husbands. A lot of their kids have been hurt, kidnapped, lost limbs. It's a very grim situation. They have no future. They have no hope. They can't even think about going back into Syria. And there's no end in sight of that revolution. So they are very receptive to the good news of Jesus Christ. So she reads to them. These are recent pictures, by the way, sent to me from Syria, these refugee camps. And then she asks, who wants to accept Christ? And you'll notice every hand goes up. And then she prays for them, and they do their altar call. And they pray the sinner's prayer together, and then they all get so excited. They've just received Jesus. You see the picture of them. This is going on in massive levels over there with multitudes. They realize that the Word became flesh and dwelt among them, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And you've got the Lord through dreams and visions and things like that. I'll be closing with talking about. Very active right now in the Middle East, in these Muslim countries, but not just there, but elsewhere in the world, like in China, in Bosnia, and other places. So that's very encouraging. Now, it says that Iran will be dismayed before their enemies. And the Hebrew word, it really means the enemies will be struck in awe when they see what happens to this disaster in Iran. It's going to be an awesome disaster. And we have to ask ourselves, does Iran have enemies plural, not just enemies, not just the Lord being upset, but do they have enemies plural today? And we'll just take a brief look at that. Of course they do. Israel's very concerned about Iran's nuclear program. They recently found out in February of this year that Iran has been operating advanced missile sites in Syria, and they've actually got a secret nuclear facility going on in Syria. And Israel is extremely concerned about Iran's nuclear program, and they will probably strike Iran. And I won't go into the reasons I believe that, but just keep your eye out for that. Some morning you could wake up and see that Israel has struck and created a major episode in the Middle East to deal with Iran's nuclear program. What about the international community? They're so concerned about Iran as potential enemies that they're negotiating with Iran, trying to get them to not have nuclear weapons. And Iran has threatened terrorism throughout the world if their nuclear facility is struck. They've also threatened to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which at its widest spot is 21 nautical, narrow spot rather, is 21 nautical miles. And still about a third of the world's oil comes through there. And that would be potentially a global economic collapse. That's what they're threatening there. And they've done war exercises and things like that demonstrating they are prepared to do that. So the international community. What about the GCC? I was talking about them earlier, the Gulf Cooperative Council of the Arab states across the Gulf. They're very concerned about Iran's quest for more and more power to spread its hegemony throughout the Middle East. Presently, Iran controls the capital of Iraq, Baghdad, with the Shiite leadership there. It controls Beirut with the Hezbollah, that's Lebanon. It controls Damascus with Bashar al-Assad's regime, that's in Syria. And it now controls Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. So they are spreading their hegemony throughout, and they're Shiite Muslims. Most of the Middle East is Sunni Muslims. Differences there. And so they're very, very concerned about them. And the GCC would be Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain. They're right across the Gulf over there. They're so concerned about Iran's nuclear program. I'm going to spend a moment on this. Because Iran recently had a 6.8 earthquake in April of 2013 that killed 37 people and injured many, many more. And that same week, further down the coast, they had a 7.7. Now, when this earthquake hit, Iran, the GCC was very concerned that this could result into a nuclear disaster, an Israeli strike, or a bigger earthquake. It almost did result in a disaster. Russia sent its scientists down to check out the fuel rods to make sure they were okay as a result of this disaster. Now, 2/3 of the world's desalination plants are in the GCC area there in the Persian Gulf. Water is a very rare commodity over there. And so what they did is they conducted a study. And they issued the study in July of 2013. And here's what they said. The risk of radiation from Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, if there is an accident, is extremely high to the GCC state. Studies suggest that any leak from the plant will affect the GCC's water supplies, especially the desalination plant operations. In the event of a radiation leak, clouds of radioactive material will drift to the GCC states in just 15 hours. While the radiation would affect only 10% of the Iranian population, and the GCC states 40 to 100% of the population would be affected. They're just across the Gulf. And they rely heavily on the Persian Gulf for their water needs. That's why they have all those desalination plants. So what they decided to do, first of all, they said only 10% of Iran would be affected. Remember, this prophecy is going to affect only one part of Iran. There's going to be another prophecy with Persia that comes after this prophecy. So, but only about 10% they say will be affected in Iran. And that's because in Iran, you have these Zagros Mountains, which at various points are 550 miles long by 150 miles wide. And they've always served as a geographical barrier between Elam and Persia. So the nuclear radiation is going to probably get locked into there, and then the wind patterns will blow them across the sea, across the air, into the GCC countries. This is what they're concerned about. They're so concerned that they decided to build the world's longest pipeline, stretching 1,242 miles, at the cost of $10.5 billion. It'll be completed by 2020, and it's not for oil, that oil-rich region there. It's for water. That's how concerned they are about an Israeli strike or an earthquake on that nuclear facility. It is a nuclear disaster waiting to happen. And that's what the Lord says. Because he's so fiercely angry, he's going to bring about a disaster in Elam, and the enemies are going to be awestruck when they see it, and there's going to be a worldwide dispersion when the bow is broken at the foremost of its might. Could we be talking about a nuclear disaster? Was Jeremiah trying to warn us about a prophecy that may be very relevant for our time? My concern is that he was. So what about Iran? Have they fiercely angered the Lord? You know, not all of Iran's history has angered the Lord. There was a good time in Persia. King Cyrus was anointed by the Lord. You know, but presently we have to ask ourselves, what about this ruthless Islamic radical regime over there? And I'd like to use the analogy, 3 strikes you're out. First of all, they hate Israel. They had a World Without Zionism conference in 2005, and that's when Mohammed Ahmadinejad said he wanted to wipe Israel off the map. And that sentiment has been echoed to the generals, the leaders, the mullahs, even the Ayatollah. Matter of fact, in these negotiations, on November 10th, just 2 weeks before the last deadline of the negotiations, Ayatollah tweeted his 9 points of how to eliminate Israel. Now, do you think he really wants a deal? He's telling us, and okay, point number 1, why should the Zionist regime be eliminated? He explains why. Point number 2, what does the elimination of Israel mean? Point 3, what is the proper way of eliminating Israel? And number 7, what is the most urgent military action to take to confront Israel? So Israel takes this very seriously. Remember 100 years ago, the Holocaust? It wasn't even 100 years ago. They're not going to go with this. And so is God angry with this disposition with Ayatollah and the mullahs? Well, I would say so, because we have God is planning to uphold his holy name, we're told in Ezekiel 39:7, through Israel in this Gog and Magog invasion. God's going to stop that invasion with fire and brimstone and hailstone, and we're told that in the aftermath, the acknowledgement will be, he will have made his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel, and they will not profane his name anymore, and then the nations shall know that he's the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So if Iran wipes out Israel, is the Lord going to be able to uphold his holy name in the midst of his people Israel? Well, we got a problem there. Who do you think is going to win that confrontation? Social injustice, strike 2. You know, in Iran right now, the mullahs are very repressive on the peoples there. You know, they took over in 1979. Now, about 70% of the population in Iran is under 35 years old, which means they were raised in Muslim families, but they weren't really around at the time when the revolution took place. And immediately there was an 8-year war when Iran went into Iraq and fought this war of attrition. And so Islam has been very repressive for them over there. If a woman doesn't wear a hijab, her headdress, she can be thrown in jail. There's one example, you can pick it up on YouTube, of a gal who refused to wear a hijab. She got thrown in jail. She was in there 2 years without any legal representation. They broke her knees. They gave her no medical treatment. In the 3rd year, no medical, no legal treatment, they raped her 5 times. And now she's out and she's ruined, and you can see her testimony. I don't even know if she's a believer or a Christian, but they can do that just because you don't comply. So social injustice. Here's another example. Some of you may be familiar with Pharrell Williams. He's a pop star over here. He's on the show The Voice. He wrote a book called Happy. He wrote a song called Happy. It's a really great song. And I've had time, I would sing it. I'd go jump on the piano and play it for you, but I'll spare you that. I used to be a musician, by the way. I used to play piano in Hawaii. But you see a picture up there. There were 6 Iranians, 3 guys, 3 gals, and they got out of their Iranian garb and dressed like Westerners, and they took their iPhones and they made a really cute video, a tribute to this song by Pharrell Williams. It took them about 8 hours, and it went viral on YouTube in Iran. And what happened immediately, how many of you heard about this? You really want to check this out on YouTube. It's an amazing situation. But because they had their names on the bottom of it, the Iranian authorities found them in 6 hours. And here's a picture of what happened. They got arrested. They had to recant and deny, that they felt they were influenced falsely to do this thing. They ended up getting jail sentences. I think some of them have been commuted as long as they don't do anything wrong. Some of them even got 99 lashes or something like that. Of course, if you don't wear your hijab, you can be back in jail and get your 99 lashes. But that's social injustice. Strike 3, and I think this is the big one, in addition to strike 1 with Israel, is the persecution of the Christianity movement over there, the Christians. Like Hormoz Shariat said, 2 years ago the Ayatollah came out because Christianity was burgeoning so fast that they issued an edict to close all home churches over there, to imprison all pastors and persecute all Christians. Saeed al-Badini, of course, is one of those examples. Here's another example of 2 gals, Maryam Rostanpour and Marizia Mirzadeh, and that's not how you pronounce her name, but I did my best. They became Christians. They didn't know each other. They went over to Turkey, because you can go to Turkey for 3 months and get discipled, because they're hungry for discipleship over there. They have some home churches that haven't been shut down in Turkey yet. And they got to meet each other. So they became sisters in the Lord. Now, the case with them, as is the case with many Iranians who go to Turkey for discipleship, is they don't have enough money to go and leave Turkey. It's costly and a lot of paperwork required. So they end up back in Iran. And they go back in Iran willfully to preach the gospel, because they felt they were dead in Islam as it was. So they realized they go back at the risk of being killed or imprisoned, and that doesn't matter to them. They feel obligated to go back. In this case, these gals were passing out 20,000 Bibles in the main city of Tehran, and they got caught. And they wrote a book called Captain in Iran. They've since gotten out, but they were sentenced to be executed. And they spent 256 days in Evin prison, which is notoriously the worst prison in the Middle East, and especially in Iran. And they were scheduled to die. And what happened was they started turning the prison into a church. They started praying for people and preaching Jesus, and they just didn't know what to do with them. And there was enough public outcry in the world that they actually got out. I think that was around 2010. This is a great book. I've read it. They're reading my book presently. Very wonderful story you want to check on. And of course, we know Saeed Abedini. We talked about him. Just another example. Christian persecution. 3 strikes, and Iran is out. And they want to wipe Israel off the map. Now let's get into the spiritual showdown. We've been talking about the nuclear showdown, those first 4 verses. What about these last 2 verses? Very good news to Iran. This is why Iranians are happy about what the Bible has to say about their future. Hormoz Shariat, his mission statement is transforming Iran into a Christian nation in this generation because of these 2 verses we're about to go over. He believes they're living in the last days. He's excited to see the multitudes coming to Christ. Well, there was about 500 Christians in 1979 before the revolution. Now they estimate there's at least 1 million. They can't get a head count. There's probably more like 5 million. And they're coming to the Lord in multitudes.